I'm a strong believer that the best way to really learn something is to actually get your hands dirty and do it. A big part for you and I as we go through this course together is to make sure that you get hands-on practice that you deserve to have to really learn the content. And a great way of doing that is building your own hands-on lab. So in this session, you and I get to take a look at some options we have in building a lab to provide that environment for hands-on practice, and also equally important to keep us out of trouble. So let's begin our discussion of a lab idea with you being this user here. So you are sitting here at your computer right here, and you want to start practicing, which is, by the way, a great idea. However, it could be a really bad idea or a bad news for you if you load up the tools onto your computer and start using them on this network, especially if you're not in charge of that network and doesn't have written permissions to use the tools. So instead of using a live network that you is not responsible for and doesn't have permissions for, here's another idea. You can create your own network, and for example, maybe here's your PC, and you then, as part of this lab, you could have other computers, including Kali Linux. And Kali Linux is a Linux distribution with tons and tons of attack tools pre-built into the distribution. Also, on his test network, we might want to have various Windows servers, whether it's 2016 or 2012, or some really very old ones like 2003, for example. We also need some Windows hosts that might include, for example, Windows 7, Windows 8, Windows 10, etc. There is also some really cool machines out there we can put on our network to test our attack tools, like Metasploitable, which has some open vulnerabilities ready to go, as well as OWASP BWA, which is Broken Web Applications project. So maybe we have another machine for the Metasploitable, and then another one for the Broken Web Applications project from OWASP. And the challenge that you might very quickly realize is that where are you going to get all of those different machines? And the great news is that most of those can be virtualized. So we don't have to have physical systems for each of them. You could be using an application called an hypervisor. One of the most popular hypervisors out there is from VMware. It's a product called VMware Workstation. They also have an equivalent version or similar version for the Mac called Fusion. And there are other vendor products as well, like VirtualBox. And what those hypervisors like VMware Workstation allows us to do is to create virtual machines on the same computer. So for example, let's say you have a network, let's say standard like 192.168.1.0. What you could do is to create a Kali Linux box as a virtual machine. You could create virtual machines for Windows servers, Windows hosts. You could create a virtual machine from Metasploitable, and the list goes on. Now, here's the trick. If your computer is a production environment, that 192 network, we really don't, especially without permission, want to allow these virtual machines have access to this network. So what we could do in VMware Workstation and in other virtualization tools, it is very similar. We could create additional networks. For example, in VMware Workstation, we could create VMNet1. So just think of VMNet1, for example, as a separate virtualized network, meaning it's separated from the physical adapter on your computer. And then if we logically place the Kali Linux box in the Windows servers and or hosts in the Metasploitable box, and we connect all of the virtual networks adapters on those virtual machines to VMNet1, let's say they could all talk and work with each other. And we could keep that traffic isolated and off the production network. Now, on the other hand, if this is your home network and you are totally in charge of it and you want to use this network as well, another option would be to, instead of using VMnet1, we could bridge each of those adapters from Metaexploitable, from Windows, and from the Kali Linux box over to that physical network. And if we did a bridging option as opposed to assign those VMs a separate network, then it says if each of those virtual machines is directly connected to the same VLAN, which corresponds to the subnet, in my case 192.168.1.0, and as an additional option if you had two physical network interface cards. And the reason I'm saying this, and I wanted to point out these options conceptually, because I wanted to make sure that you are not accidentally placing virtual machines, especially with attack tools that you plan on testing and working with. You do not want to have those actively working on networks you are not authorized to use those tools. So as you and I go through the sessions together, I'm going to use the 192.168.1 network. That's my physical wireless network that is all bridged together in my home office. And I'm going to bridge all of my virtual machines to that network. So as you build your lab environment, just be aware of whether or not you want to actually put those virtual machines on the real network we're physically connected to or wirelessly connected to, versus connecting all your virtual machines to some virtualized network that is created inside of VMware Workstation. This is the concept of using virtualization to create our virtual machines that we can use as a test bed for our lab environment, as well as the concepts of how we can make sure we are keeping that traffic in those virtual machines separate from any type of production or any other networks that we are not authorized to use those tools.